Hello again, and welcome to the lecture for Wednesday, October 28th. And so today we're going to continue on Chapter 9 topic of production. Got a lot of information I'm going to kind of throw your direction today. And then we'll wrap things up on Friday, the 30th, with the Chapter 9 material of production. So that's the game plan for the next couple of days. A lot of this, if you've taken an accounting class, you're going to see some parallels to that. And that's probably about as close to accounting as we get in economics, is a lot of the material here. There's going to be very similar. I like to say the accountants kind of based it off the economist, not the other way around, but you can make up your own mind after we're done covering the material. But before we do that, just a couple quick things coming up here. And I've pretty much listed everything that's going on between now and the end of the semester, with the exception of the third midterm and the final exam. So, as we speak right now, all this stuff is available. Quiz 9 is obviously due this week, end of the week. Quiz 10 is also available, as are 11 and 12. I've made all that information out there already. There are a total of 15 weeks of the semester. There's a good chance that I'll have it all posted by the end of next week. So, first week of November, you'll have everything out that you'll need to complete the class with the exception of the two exams. And so that's kind of my game plan, is to give you the opportunity to work ahead if you want to. Don't feel like you're obligated to. You keep up at whatever pace makes you comfortable. That's kind of the objective here. So Quiz 9 due this week. Assignment 4 is the next assignment due. This is the one where you choose your business. This one will be due on the 13th, which is Friday. So that's 2 weeks from this coming Friday. And then the last assignment, assignment 5. This one has to do with income inequality. I'm currently working on it. And so I should have that posted here in the next couple of days, if not today. And that'll be due on the 4th of December, which seems like it's forever from now. But realistically speaking, it'll probably be here before we know it. A couple other things to look at. Obviously, the application paper that I mentioned, and we'll continue to mention, I'll pretty much have this up here, going forward, is going to be due on Monday, the 7th of December. And that is going to be a little more detailed than just your regular assignment. I do have some information on what necessarily the expectations are, as well as the topics you can choose from. And I've actually already gotten a couple emails about that. Some of the things we haven't talked about yet, other things we have. So if you want to kind of put together some thoughts on something and then wait until we kind of refine it with the material, that's great. Obviously, you still have plenty of time to work on that. I just don't want it to be one of those things where all of a sudden the weekend before and you're basically trying to scatter and get ready to do something that's going to take you a few hours to work on. And then there is the ongoing Learn Smart exercises. And so that's the one that requires the access to the McGraw-Hill website. There are a total of 16 of those worth 100 points. Excuse me while I take a sip of coffee here. And for the most part, and granted, I'd like you to do all of them, but realistically speaking, depending on what your grade objective is, do you necessarily going to want to get the full 100 points based upon the amount of time it's going to take you to go through those? And that's a decision you can make. So if you want to go through those and use those as exam prep, that's great. If you want to go through and just knock them all out at once, that's fine too. It's entirely up how you do it. But keep in mind, yes, it's an assigned item, but there's 16 different components worth about 6 to 8 points each, I guess it is. And, if you don't want the full 100 points, you can stop after doing whatever you want in terms of getting the point allocation. So I just kind of want to throw that out there. And also keep in mind, I keep the top 10 quizzes. So if you've missed a few, at this point, as long as you finish the rest of them, you should be in good shape. And I'm basically going to drop the lowest grades and I'll keep the 10 highest grades. So even if you've got one out there where you're like, oh man, I didn't do so good, I got like a 5 or 6 out of 10. Ultimately, if it happens to be one of your worst grades, I'll drop it. And so kind of keep that in mind going forward, that it's not necessarily going to hurt your grade as long as you're doing all of them. So that's kind of where we stand at this point. November's right around the corner. And I want to lead off today's a lecture talking a little bit about Amazon. Now, Amazon's one of those companies, much like Walmart, where people either love them or hate them. I'm personally a fan, and I think Amazon's changed the world, largely for the better. Has it come with some drawbacks? Absolutely. You might say, well, Amazon is a job killer. They're dominating the market. But at the same time, it's also allowed a lot of independent sellers to become millionaires. So you take the good with the bad. There's never going to be a perfect scenario. But my question that I want to lead off today with is, why is Amazon, and I cross out the word often and put usually, cheaper than brick and mortar retailers? If you're looking to save some money on something, how many people go straight to Amazon and see if they can find it there? I do. And especially In this year, 2020, do I really want to go out to a store and look for something? No. I'd rather just order from Amazon. With Prime, I can have it sitting on my doorstep the next day. I don't have to be bothered with going out to a store and worrying about all the rules necessary to comply with everything going on right now. I can simply just have it delivered. And I think Amazon has really changed the retail industry because what they've done is largely eliminate a lot of the overhead expenses that businesses deal with. Have you ever been in an Amazon store? I know they exist. I think there actually is one in Columbus, Ohio, if I'm not mistaken, where you can actually go in. It's a physical location. But it's not the same thing as going into Walmart or Kohl's or Target. It's a completely different thing because it's a warehouse. Amazon's an online platform and they have distribution centers and fulfillment centers across the globe, but specifically across the country. There's several bigger facilities not too far away from where we are here in central Ohio, and they'll simply just ship something out. It's a very efficient system, and that efficiency saves money. And that's why they're often able to pass on those savings to consumers, much like Walmart can because of their size. And that gets directly to the concept of economies of scale, which we'll be talking about here a little bit today, but also definitely on Friday. So if I can get my clicker to work, there we go. I had finished class on Monday talking about long run versus short run planning decisions. And I want to use Disney World as an example. And so short run, we're assuming that certain aspects of production are fixed and cannot easily be changed. So we often refer to this as capital. And we assume that a business in the short run has fixed levels of capital, meaning their equipment is not necessarily going to be replaced relatively easily or quickly. Buildings, things of that nature. So if you think of a manufacturer, think of all the heavy equipment going into manufacturing, that's not something they can replace overnight. But we're assuming that everything else is relatively flexible, especially labor. And so we're going to break it down into really two different inputs, capital versus labor. We're going to assume, and not to interrupt, but ironically enough, an Amazon Prime truck just drove by my house on the very topic that we were discussing. So we're going to assume that labor is flexible in the short run, meaning that I can alter my work schedule. I can go out and hire somebody relatively quickly, but I can't build a brand new factory overnight. So let's use an example that most people are familiar with, Disney World. And even if you've never been there, you know what it is, right? The huge, huge theme park in Florida, and that's just Disney, the regular Disney that's been around for a long time. There's so many other parks in that area. It's a huge tourist destination, even right now, for people from across the globe. So Disney is a global brand. It's well known. Disney World has certain things they can change in the short run, certain things they can change in the long run. So a great example of this is how is Disney World adapting to the realities of faced with public health right now. So obviously the state of Florida, as well as the local area, as well as Disney as a company, is going to have certain policies designed to do what? Protect public health, because the last thing they want to do is have their locations shut down. The last thing they want to do is have people get sick. And so they've put in certain protocols that they can do in the short run. Social distancing, for example, limiting the number of people in the park. These are little things they can do in the short run to make sure that the business is operating. What they can't do, however, is build a brand new theme park overnight. That takes years. And that is going to be a long run decision. So if Disney World decides, well, there's some changes out there we need to adapt to, and they're not going away anytime soon, when it comes time to building new attractions, building new lodging, such as hotels and resorts, anything from rides to swimming pools to stores, you name it, they might build them a little bit differently. And those are long run decisions because they can change everything over the long run. Disney World can decide to add more employees. They can decide to add more space. They can decide to acquire more land to build a brand new theme park. They can do all those things. So realistically speaking, the short run and long run aren't a defined time frame because it depends on the business. So a large capital intensive business like a theme park or an airline or a manufacturer, think how long it would take Honda to decide to build a brand new manufacturing facility. It'd probably take them years. And the reason is because they have to figure out what they want to make. They got to figure out where they're going to put it. They got to figure out how they're going to build it. They're going to have to get all the equipment there. They're going to have to hire people. It could be a decade before they're up and running. That is a very long period of time. On the other hand, if I have a small business, and let's say I'm an Amazon seller, just to use that example again, what's it going to take for me to change everything? I can probably change everything in a day. I can change not just, my the easy stuff, but I can completely revamp my platform in a relatively short period of time. So long run versus short run has nothing to do with actual time. It has to do with the scope of what's involved in changing all my inputs. So a long run, you can change everything. Short runs, we're assuming certain things are fixed. So on that note, fixed versus variable inputs. A fixed input is something like capital. It's there no matter what. The way I like to look at it is this. Picture a restaurant, and immediately what comes to my mind is someplace like Subway, Jimmy John's, one of those places where you walk in, you order, they make it right there in front of you, they hand it to you, boom, you're done. Chipotle's another one. If you're in Central Ohio, Bibi Bop's one of my favorites. You go in there, you pretty much just point, they make it, boom, you're finished. So there's a lot of restaurants with that model. Now, we realize that when they're open, there's certain inputs they use versus when they're closed. So think of your standard Subway, Jimmy John's, Chipotle kind of place like that in the middle of the night when they're closed. All the equipment's still there. It's just sitting there idle. There's nobody in there. The equipment's still there. And in the morning when somebody comes in to open, they're going to turn the lights on, they're going to turn the equipment on, there are going to be people there, they're going to open the doors, and the next thing you know, they're serving meals. Fixed inputs are the things that cannot immediately be changed, and they're going to be there, like the equipment, for example, the building itself. So if Chipotle wants to build a brand new location, it's going to take them a while to do so. That's a long run decision. Variable inputs directly relate to what's being produced. So for the restaurant, it's obvious. Food, because clearly if they're not serving any meals, say for instance there's a local business shutdown for 2 weeks and they're not allowed to open. Well, what are they going to do? They're going to order any more food so they can prep it to make meals with? No, it doesn't make sense to do that. They're also not going to have people working for that very reason. So most labor is considered to be variable. The number of workers you have, the number of hours they're working are directly related to what's being produced, as is things like food and other resources. Capital, however, is assumed to be fixed. The equipment's not going anywhere. It's going to be there whether or not you produce 0 units of output or 1 million units of output. And associated with these inputs, we have costs. So this is kind of where we get into these accounting parallels. We have fixed costs versus variable costs. Fixed costs in the accounting world is often referred to as overhead. If a business has high overhead, that means they have a lot of fixed costs they have to pay for, even if they're producing nothing. So fixed costs would be things like rent, any kind of equipment that you basically have to pay to maintain, and maybe certain kinds of taxes, like a property tax, for example. If you own a location, the property tax is due no matter what your sales look like. Insurance is a good example of a fixed cost. A certain level of electricity or utilities, enough to keep the equipment on in the middle of the night when it's not being used. So obviously if you have a restaurant, a refrigerator, or a walk-in freezer, those things take power. Even if you're not there and you're not serving any meals, you still have to pay the electric bill. So certain fixed costs, they're going to be directly associated with fixed inputs, whereas the variable costs are going to be associated with things like labor, or in this case, food, or certain raw materials, or certain things, even electricity to some extent, because you're going to use more of it when you're obviously producing something, and if you're leaving the equipment sit there idly. So fixed costs are related to fixed inputs, variable costs are related to variable inputs. Which brings us to something referred to as a sunk cost. Now, I got one example here I want to use because I think it's a good one, but I want to start off with another one. And it's the idea of dropping a course. So let's say you're enrolled in a course like this one. Another sip of coffee here. And you decide that it's not worth it. You're too busy. You got too much going on in life. You're worried that you're going to have bad grades, all across the board if you have taken too many courses. And you decide to drop. Usually it's not a problem, depending on what point in the semester you do it. Even if you wait until close to the very end, if you get instructor permission, and that's something I'm usually pretty lenient with, given the circumstances, that you can drop the class, no questions asked. But if you wait until after, like, say, the first week of the semester, you're not going to get a penny of your tuition back. So should the fact that you already spent the money influence whether or not you drop the course? The answer is no. Because the tuition at that point is what's called a sunk cost. It's already been paid. You're not going to get any of it back if you drop the course. So that should not influence your decision to drop, because no matter what happens, you're not going to get it back. So the idea of a sunk cost is it's simply money, or in the case, it could be time, really. If you're thinking about time, the cost of time. If you've already done something, and no matter what your decision is, you're not going to get back the time or the money you've invested to get to that point, it shouldn't play a role in your decision making. And so another great example of a sunk cost is renting to own. If you ever go to those rent to own places, so you can go out and buy brand new furniture and it's going to cost you like $99 a month, but you got to pay it like over 5 years. And once you paid it, you have the option of basically saying it's now yours. Now, of course, how do those businesses make money? Well, they charge a lot in terms of the monthly payment relative to what it actually costs them to buy it. So you're basically paying for that furniture 50% above what you would actually pay if you went out and bought it. But the reason you're doing this is because A, you might not really want it at the end of the rental period, and B, you might not be able to afford to go out and buy your own anyway. So some people engage in rent to own. It's the same thing with a car if you lease it. A lease basically is going to cost you less money per month. But there's certain rules that you have to adhere to, such as not driving excess miles. And once the lease is over with, you have to bring the car back in. And if it's in good shape, then you won't be penalized. If there's damage, you might be penalized for it. But you also have the right to buy it at the end of the lease. And it's the same concept. Are you obligated, or should you even buy that car at the end of the lease? Since you've been paying for it already, it's a sunk cost. You're not getting that money back. Same thing with rent to own. You're not getting the money back if you decide, well, I don't want to keep this versus if I do, because either way, you've already spent the money. So you might say, well, gee, I'll go ahead and complete the purchase point at the end of that period of time. Sunk cost should not play a role in decisions because the opportunity cost is pretty clear. The money or time has already been spent. So if you say, yes, I want to keep it, or no, I don't want to keep it, the opportunity cost is really no different, at least regard to that initial sunk cost. So I want to use Jimmy John's as an example that I talked about a minute ago, just to kind of pull some of this stuff together. So Jimmy John's has fixed cost. Now, when I used to live in Kentucky and not too far from my house, there was a local business guy that decided to open up a Jimmy John's franchise. Super nice guy. I mean, he was there all the time. I mean, he worked harder and longer hours than any of the employees. He wanted to make sure that place was successful. And every time you go in there, you'd see him working. Half the time he'd be the one making your sandwich. I mean, he was just a really energetic person. And imagine what it would take to open up a franchise like that. You've got to pay for the franchise fees, first of all. You got to pay to use Jimmy John's name and their brand. You got to pay to use their recipe, so in terms of what the sandwiches are and their menu and things like that. You got to pay for the real estate. In this case, this man was renting in a little strip mall. You're paying for the equipment. You're paying for insurance. Think of all the money you're spending up front before that first customer walks in and you say, hey, what can I get you today? That's how much it's going to cost you. And then you have fixed costs that are continuing after you're open. Because once again, your rent's still due the first of the month. Your insurance company still wants their premium payments. The property taxes are still paid. All these things that you have to pay for, no matter whether you're serving any customers or not. So think of it like this. If you get a bill and your response is, well, I'm not that successful right now. I'm not bringing in much money. And the person issues the bill, says, I don't care. We want our money. It's pretty much a fixed cost. So we have those. We also have variable costs. So in the case of Jimmy John's, clearly food is a variable cost. Clearly labor is a variable cost. Now, any restaurant that I've ever been associated with, either working at or as a customer, always had schedules according to when we were the busiest. So lunchtime for Jimmy John's, yeah, you're going to have full staff. Dinner time, depending on the location, maybe not so much. 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, are you going to have every single worker there? No, because there's not really enough for all of them to do. 3 o'clock in the morning, depends on the business. You might have some places that are busy at that hour, other places not. So you're going to have, your labor is going to be kind of related to your need for actual workers because of the need for the underlying product. All costs are either fixed or variable, all of them. Now, some might be a little bit of both. So you might say, for example, well, some labor is a fixed cost because maybe you have to have a manager on duty all the time. Or maybe there's security that has to be there all the time, whether or not the place is open or closed. So those might be considered fixed costs. A lot of labor, on the other hand, is variable cost. Electricity for a location like Jimmy John's, absolutely, is going to be partially fixed, but mostly variable. Their electric bill, if they were shut down for a month, they're still going to get an electric bill because the equipment's still going to be on. But they're obviously going to use more electricity when they're open. So all costs have to be either fixed or variable. A short run decision for Jimmy John's. What happens when they anticipate being really busy and yet they can't necessarily change the size of their dining room? They can't change the size of their kitchen. They can't go out and get new equipment, and they certainly can't relocate. So maybe they figure out ways to move their labor around. That's a short run decision. Long run would be, you know what, this location is not working for us. We're always busy. People can't get in. We're losing business because people see the line to get in and they're turning around. So ultimately, we want to be in a new location. That's a long run decision. I saw this happen, and actually Chick-fil-A is a good example of this too, but I saw it happen with Starbucks, where my local Starbucks at one point, for whatever reason, their when you go and order at the menu, it wasn't working. So they had employees out there that basically had tablets in their hand and they were placing the orders on the tablet for you. And it was like 10 degrees outside. So I really felt bad for these employees, but it was a workaround, right? The equipment broke, and rather than simply saying we're closed until we can replace the equipment, they shuffled their labor around to the point to make it work. That's an example of a short run decision. A long run decision is basically saying, what would it take? How long would it take for us to get rid of everything and start from scratch? Not too far from my house, there's a Tim Hortons that is in the process of remodeling. And rather than remodel the store, you know what they did to it? They tore it down. Right now, it's a vacant lot. They basically raised the whole location and they started from scratch because ultimately it's cheaper to do that as opposed to remodeling the existing location. Just take the wrecking ball to it, haul away all the rubble, and build a brand new location. That's a long run decision for them. They chose to be in the same location, but they're choosing to build a brand new store at that spot. So let's talk about what a production function is. This is in my lecture on Monday. I talked briefly about using factors of input and kind of like a recipe where you figure out what combinations work best. Well, the production process or the production function is the recipe. So I'm going to look at Delta Airlines as an example. So how do we determine what it takes to get a plane off the ground in, let's say, hypothetically, Columbus, Ohio, and land in Miami, Florida? So obviously, for that flight to take place, we need certain things. The aircraft, because without the aircraft, nothing's going to happen. We need fuel. We need crew. So 2 pilots in all likelihood, several flight attendants, depending on the size of the aircraft. We need people to work at the gate to make sure people are getting on the plane. We need people at the airport, for that matter. You know, we need people at TSA to screen them. We need all the functions that exist in terms of labor that it takes to get an aircraft off the ground. Everything from the people refueling the plane to air traffic control. You know, there's a lot of people involved in that process. All those things have to be in place. So let's say hypothetically that air traffic controllers weren't working. What's going to happen? Is the plane going to get off the ground? No. Even if we have flight attendants and a pilot and a plane fuel, it's not going to go anywhere. So there's a certain amount of labor that goes into that. Capital, obviously, the aircraft itself. Electricity, different systems that are needed to get the plane off the ground. All these things that we think about necessary, they all have to be there. What happens if we have too much of one thing and not enough of another? Then it might not work very well. What happens if we're a pilot short? Well, then they have to go out and find one. Otherwise, the plane can't leave the ground because of regulations. And so all these different combinations, if you can think about it, it's a recipe. So you better believe there's somebody at Delta Airlines that pretty much knows where an aircraft's going to be and figures out how to get it there and has crew scheduled and knows how much fuel it's going to take and knows how many passengers are going to be on there and has a certain amount of idea how many bags are going to be underneath. They schedule and plan all these things because it's a production function. And honestly, it's a pretty complex one. But let me get back to the Jimmy John's example. What's it take for me to order a number 9 off the menu? I mean, to be honest with you, I'm not even sure what a number 9 is anymore. I used to be a regular, but maybe they changed the menu. There's going to be certain things that go into it. So if I say I want a number 9, they're going to basically slice the bread for me right there. Excuse me. And ask me what I want on it besides what comes with it, right? And so they're going to make it right there in front of me. They got all the meat, cheese, toppings, vegetables, mayo, all that stuff right there in front of you. They'll go ahead and make it, wrap it up, tape it together, hand it to you, voila, process is done. Certain things go into that process. I used to work making pizzas and delivering pizzas when I was in high school and college. Same concept, right? Somebody says I want a large pepperoni. To this day, I know exactly how many slices of pepperoni go in a large pizza because I've made thousands of them. And so it's a process. It's a production function. It's a relationship between inputs and outputs. So think of it like that recipe. What's it take to produce something? We need a certain amount of inputs. We need it produced in this particular order. And sometimes production functions can be simple, like a recipe for cookies. Other times it can be relatively complex, like getting an aircraft off the ground and flying to a certain destination. So when we talk about measurements of production, we're going to start with the most obvious one, and this is what's referred to as total product. Total product is basically how much gets produced. How much gets produced given a certain amount of fixed inputs and variable inputs. So this is a situation where we're going to look at what happens to output as we vary labor. So we're going to assume in this example, we have a fixed amount of equipment or capital. And let's say there's 1 unit of capital. And we want to see what happens when we change the amount of labor being used to operate that capital and see how that changes our total product or our total output. So it could be anything. So maybe it's a point of sale at a retail store. So you got somebody working the point of sale where you basically have customers coming up and you're scanning everything and you're taking the payment and you're bagging it up and sending them on their way. That's a piece of capital. Go into your standard grocery store and look how many checkouts they have. Now, today we're seeing more and more self-serve checkouts, but full serve even then. How many of them have somebody standing there waiting for a customer? Not all of them. Matter of fact, there might be 1 or 2 days a year, Black Friday being one of them, where you might have every checkout where there's somebody waiting for a customer. But most of the time, it might be 1 or 2 of them. Yet there could be 25 of them. Well, why do they have so many? Because occasionally they might need them, but most of the time they're okay sitting there idle. As they're sitting there idle, nothing gets done. You have 0 labor, 1 capital, nothing gets produced. The capital itself needs people to operate. So with a point of sale at a checkout at a grocery store, 1 person gets a certain amount done. Would there ever be a reason to have 2? Sure. You have 1 person checking out and scanning, the other person bagging. That's a pretty efficient operation. However, what happens when you move to 3? Now we got problems because now we're getting in each other's way. Well, that's kind of the example I want to use or something similar to it. So the chart I've got here on the left-hand side, capital is fixed at 1 unit. So let's just say it's a piece of equipment. It could be a checkout at the grocery store. It could be a delivery truck. It could be an airplane. It could be a piece of equipment in a manufacturing facility. We want to know what happens as we alter the number of workers. So obviously, if the capital is sitting there idly and nobody's using it, nothing gets made. Nothing. The checkout, the point of sale at the grocery store, nothing gets done if it's just sitting there. There's a little chain blocking it off. You can't go through there. You have to find one that's open. The light's not on, all those things. So total product with 0 workers is equal to 0. Now, in our hypothetical circumstance, let's add 1 worker. And let's say now we're getting 2 units of output with that 1 worker. So 1 worker creates 2 units of output in a certain period of time. We add a 2nd worker. Now we bump that up to 5. So 2 workers are more efficient than 1. We keep adding workers and notice what happens. We get to 5 workers, we're maxing out at 13 units of output. We bring in a 6th worker, they're adding nothing. We get a total of 13 units with 6 workers, just as we did with 5. Then it gets interesting because with the 7th and 8th workers, they're actually producing less as a group. They're getting in each other's way. If you've ever heard the expression, too many cooks in the kitchen spoil the soup, that's exactly what this means. You simply have too much labor for the situation, and rather than producing more, they either goofing off, they're getting in each other's way, they're causing problems, creating accidents, whatever the case is, and it's actually making the situation worse. If we plot this out, we get a graph that looks like what you see there in the bottom right-hand corner. So obviously we start at 0. We see increasing output. It levels off once we have 5 or 6 workers, and it starts to taper off again. Let's talk about productivity. Productivity is typically a measurement that we would look at to determine what's getting produced per unit of input. We typically think of productivity in terms of labor. So how productive are employees? If I were to say you're a very productive person, you would likely take that as a compliment, meaning what? That you get a lot done with the resources you have, which is exactly what productivity is. And how do we measure productivity? We look at what's called average product. We simply take the total product divided by the variable input that's being used. So in this case, we're looking at average product of labor, which is abbreviated AP with a lowercase subscript, uppercase subscript L for labor. We could look at it for capital. We could look at it for a particular resource, but we're going to focus on labor because it's the most intuitive thing to look at here. Not surprisingly, you're going to reach a point of what's called diminishing average productivity, where your productivity maximizes and then decreases. So let's go back to our example here. So what I've done is added a column to this table. So the first 3 columns we saw a minute ago. The 4th column right there basically takes the Q divided by L. So notice what we're doing. Obviously, when nobody's working, we can't take 0 divided by 0. So we're simply just leaving that blank. But once we have one worker, we take the total product divided by the number of workers. So 2 divided by 1 is clearly 2. Then with the 2 workers, we take 5 divided by 2 to get 2.5. Notice what happens to this average product of labor. So you see the figures in red there, but you also see the graph on the bottom right-hand corner. It starts to go up, and it maximizes at 3 workers. At 3 workers, we're getting 3 units of output per worker on average. Then it starts to drop, and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Again, think about going into a place of business. If you've ever seen it where they have too few workers, what's the problem? There's not enough people to get the job done. And it's not a good experience, whether it's retail, whether it's a restaurant, whatever the case is. Or whether or not it's Bureau of Motor Vehicles and you're going to get your driver's license and there's 2 people behind the counter and 50 people in line, you realize you're in for a long experience. Or what happens when there's too many workers? You got people standing around doing nothing, talking to the people who are working, distracting them. Maybe they're getting in the way physically, and nothing gets done there either. There's going to be a happy medium, and that's what we're talking about, that point of maximum productivity right there with 3 workers when they're averaging 3 units of output per person. What I want to talk about next is an important topic that we're going to use quite a bit throughout the rest of the semester, and that's the concept of marginal product, or ultimately marginal product of labor. Marginal product is how much our total product changes when we add one more unit of input, in this case labor. So think of it like adding one more worker. What does it do to the total product? In labor economics, which is what we're going to close out the semester with, this is a critical value, because what it's saying essentially is, what does one additional worker contribute to my output? To stick with the example of Jimmy John's, if I'm an owner of a Jimmy John's and I'm looking to hire somebody, what questions am I asking when that person walks in the door for the interview? I want to know what they're going to bring to my organization. What are they going to be able to produce for me? Do they have experience? Do they know what they're doing? Do they have a good work ethic? Do they have a good attitude? Are they willing to show up to work on time? All those things to me would indicate that they're going to produce more, and therefore they'd be worth hiring and potentially paying more. On the other hand, what if they're slow and lazy and show up late to work and make mistakes? Then it's going to wind up being less productive for me, and I might not want to hire them. It's the exact concept that managers will focus on when making hiring decisions. The idea, first of all, do we even hire an additional person? Second of all, which person do we hire is all based upon marginal product of labor. So let's look at how that changes things with our initial example. So now we have a 5th column, and it's the marginal product of labor. And all we do is look at the difference in total product by adding an additional worker. So as we go from 0 to 1 workers, we increase from 0 to 2 in terms of total product. So our marginal product of labor there is 2. As we go from 1 to 2 workers, total product jumps from 2 to 5. So the marginal product is 3. As we go to the 3rd worker, it goes from 5 to 9, which leads to a marginal product of 4. Notice what happens here. Marginal product of labor increases up to a point, then it decreases, and eventually becomes negative. By going from 6 workers to 7 workers, we're actually decreasing our total product. That 7th worker has a marginal product of labor of -2. Do I want to hire a 7th worker or schedule a 7th worker? Absolutely not, because they're costing me money. I got to pay them, but collectively they're producing less than if I only had 6 workers. So this is where marginal product of labor is a relatively important concept. Excuse me. So we have something referred to as the point of diminishing marginal productivity. At some point, marginal product is going to maximize. And once it does, it doesn't make sense to add an additional input beyond that. With the previous example, that was with 3 workers. 3 workers was perfect to get the job done. Now, could I achieve more with 4 workers? Sure. I could achieve more with 5 too, and 6. And maybe even 7 if I think back to the example correctly. But it doesn't make sense to, because it's costing me more at that point than it's worth. Do I necessarily want to maximize production? It might not be the most efficient thing to do. Does it make sense to have 50 workers in a busy restaurant when in fact 30 is the actual amount that maximizes productivity? Maybe it might slow down the process a little bit, but ultimately it's going to be more efficient from a cost perspective. So think about going into a restaurant, and let's say, for instance, there's a bus group of people that comes into a restaurant about 2 o'clock in the afternoon for lunch. And I've been in this situation before, which is partially why I'm using it as an example. And you look at the window and you see a busload of people unloading and walking toward the front door. And all of a sudden you're thinking, oh no, they want to eat here, which is great for business, right? They're going to spend money. But most of our lunch staff is gone for the afternoon already. And now all of a sudden there's like 3 of us left, like 1 person in the kitchen and 2 servers. And we got to get all this stuff done for these people. At that point, you kind of hit the panic button and you're thinking, great, what are we going to do? So maybe you pull somebody from a different part of the restaurant to help out. Maybe you call somebody up and say, hey, you're scheduled to be here in 2 hours. Can you kind of be here now? And you bring in additional help. But at some point, bringing in additional help is actually going to be worse. You want to get to that point where you have just enough people to operate efficiently. That marginal product of labor is maximized, because if it starts to decrease, then it's going to wind up costing you more than it's worth. And so this is a topic we're going to continue to revisit pretty much over the course of the next several weeks as well. So what I want to do to wrap up today, and I might carry some of this over into Friday, is talk about costs. So total cost is basically all the costs associated with operating a business, a production process. And those total costs can be broken into 2 categories, fixed cost or variable cost. All costs have to be one or the other. So to use abbreviations, TC is total cost, FC is fixed cost, and VC is variable cost. Now, it's also helpful to look at something known as an average cost. Average total cost would be how much it costs us to produce a unit on average. This is a critical value that I'll talk more about in upcoming classes. And the reason is because, well, any business wants to know what it costs to produce something, right? And they typically want to look at it on a per unit basis. So that's a critical value. But all it is TC divided by Q, total cost divided by output. Just like average fixed cost would be fixed cost divided by output, an average variable cost would be variable cost divided by output. So we have 3 costs that we knew about already, fixed, variable, and then adding the 2 of them together gets total. Now we have 3 more. We simply look at the averages, or taking each of those values and dividing it by output. But the most important one of them all is marginal cost. How much it costs to produce 1 more of something. So I'm going to give you as an example that I've gone through more times than I can count in a previous job years and years ago. So my most recent pizza delivering job back in college, which is still 30 years ago, was at Papa John's. And I can clearly remember numerous instances where, let's say on a Monday night, we'd be open to like 11 o'clock p.m. for our location. And once about quarter to 11 rolls around, everybody's getting antsy and wants to close, right? So the manager's getting ready to shut things down. You know, we're basically hoping the phone doesn't ring with an order. You know, everybody's cleaning up and getting ready to go so we can all get out of there. It never failed that somebody would call at 5 minutes to 11 and say, I'd like to place an order. Now, here's a dilemma. We're supposed to be open at 11 o'clock. You're supposed to take the order, right? So if somebody heard about that, you know, they basically heard that we turned them down, they might complain to a district manager or somebody like that, and it could cause some problems. But realistically speaking, did it make economic sense to take the order at 5 minutes to 11 o'clock? Because what is the marginal cost of producing 1 pizza 5 minutes before closing time? Now, had they called an hour earlier and we knew we were going to be open no matter what and had to take the order, the cost would have been pretty obvious. It'd be a certain cost associated with the ingredients used to make it. A certain cost was involved in the labor to make it, which was minimal. Certain costs associated with the electricity it took to cook the pizza. Again, it's minimal. The box itself. And then you got to pay the delivery driver to take it out the door and deliver it. So marginal cost was pretty small because all the equipment was already on. All the ingredients were ready to go. You had a delivery driver standing by waiting to take that order. It wasn't that big of a deal. Once closing time gets to the point, however, you got somebody who's ready to leave. So say 5 minutes to 11, you make that pizza, you pop it in the oven. Now you're paying the delivery driver to stick around after 11 o'clock because they have to wait for the pizza to get ready, box it up, put it in the pouch, go to the car, deliver it, come back, and then they can basically cash out for the night. So we're looking at, depending on the situation, it could be an extra half hour's worth of labor that you have to pay the delivery driver. Is that worth it for the profit made on 1 pizza? So there's a chance that if somebody called up with a small order at 5 minutes to 11, we say, sorry, we closed early for the night. You're taking the chance of alienating that customer, knowing that you might actually lose money on the proposition because it's going to cost you more to make the pizza than you're actually going to make in terms of profit. That is what the marginal cost concept is. What's the cost of making one or more of something? Now, pizza is one example, but it could be anything. What's the cost of adding one more student to a section of Econ 2200? It's minimal, right? Because essentially, once the course is full, especially with an online class, you just have to get instructor permission. And it's my decision if it's worth the cost to me. So I might say, well, gee, I got 35 students in the class. What's a 36th? It takes me an extra few minutes to grade everything. It's not going to be that big of a deal. Sure, no problem. What happens, though, if it's a physical classroom and the classroom's already full? Now what do we have to do? Now we got to find another classroom to offer a new section. Now we got to find somebody to teach that section. All those things are going to cost time and money. And so at some point, the marginal cost is going to outweigh the marginal benefit. So I want to close with this example, and then we're going to continue this on Friday. Well, at least the idea with costs anyway. I found this a few years ago, and I thought it was a good starting point for a conversation because I honestly think these numbers are a bit skewed. But I've always wondered this myself. How much does a Starbucks drink cost to make? And so you got to figure what goes into it. Now, they use cappuccino here. I don't think that's the most popular Starbucks drink by far. You're probably looking at any variety of other things that would be. But somebody tried to break it down in terms of what the cost was. And I believe this is an Australian example. So they were using Australian values and they use metric here. But, excuse me, let's talk about this. They figured out, first of all, how many coffee beans does it take to make this? They figured out of a kilogram or 2.2 pounds of coffee beans, they can get 100 cups of 8 ounces of coffee. So 30 cents worth of coffee goes into making this. Now they're negating the water because obviously water is not that expensive anyway, but it would add to the cost. Then you've got the milk. And so they're assuming that it would cost about 40 cents worth of milk. Then you got the cup and the lid. That's not cheap, by the way. Those things add up. There's a reason why Starbucks came up with those sleeves to put over the cup as opposed to doubling up on cups with hot drinks, because the cup itself costs a lot of money. And when you're doing that thousands of times a day, franchise-wide, it starts to add up. So they came up with the corrugated cardboard sleeves to put on there, which were substantially cheaper. So anyway, that's about 25 cents worth. Then they're assuming there's the others. So you go over and you set your cappuccino down, you pop the lid off, and you get some sugar and you pour it in there and you stir it in there, and then you throw out the remains. That's not cheap either. Those things are going to add up, but we're assuming that on average, we're looking about 5 cents worth of materials. So they figure, excuse me, the total cost for this 8-ounce cappuccino was $1. And they're just like, wait, Starbucks is selling these things for $3.50. So they're making $2.50 a cup, and they're making a huge amount of profit on these. I see their point. Starbucks does have expensive drinks. But let's look at one factor they're not even considering here, and that's labor. Now, I've never worked at a Starbucks, but I've been to so many and ordered so many thousands of drinks, I'm pretty confident that the process to make a drink like this involves a lot more labor than it does to pour a cup of drip coffee. Clearly, a lot more labor. I've seen people working that espresso machine, and they're not slackers. They're putting in the effort, and they're cranking out the drinks. And it's not a job I'd want, but it's one I certainly respect people doing. And those machines are time sensitive, right? It takes a while to make a drink. And especially when Starbucks says, well, if you don't like it the first time, we'll remake it. And so it's going to take a little bit of extra effort to remake the drink. And so if you order something that's going to be based off the espresso machine, prepare to stand there and wait for a few minutes and wait for that to happen, because you're paying labor. Now, Starbucks is not paying $7.25 an hour anywhere. I'm pretty sure about that. So their jobs for people that work there will be paid a little bit better than that. They might even have benefits associated with a lot of those positions. So labor costs aren't cheap. So let's say hypothetically it costs Starbucks $20 out of pocket per hour to pay a barista. And it takes that barista, let's say for instance, 3 minutes to make a drink. That's basically, what, 1/20th of an hour, or about $1 worth of labor to make that drink. And so we're not taking that into consideration either. So if we slap that extra $1 worth of labor on there, now we're up to $2. So they're only making $1.50. But then again, what other costs do they face? You got to keep the lights on in the store, right? You got to pay to repair or upgrade or maintain that espresso machine. There's a lot of equipment in the Starbucks. What happens with waste? What happens when a drink gets screwed up and you have to pour it out and make another one? So you have these things. And you're paying labor in many cases when they're not necessarily making a lot of drinks. So it's not like they're constantly cranking one drink out every 3 minutes for an entire shift. There's times when there might be some idleness and you have to basically clean up and you have to do all the other things associated with operating a business, and you're not directly making money from those. So there's what's called fixed costs and overhead that you have to deal with also. So when it comes down to it, is Starbucks making a profit off a $3.50 drink or more? Absolutely. Are they making $2.50 of pure cash? No, they're not, because this fails to take into consideration fixed cost and labor cost. So on that note, I want to set the stage for the example I want to use for Friday's lecture. So I'm going to kind of pull all this together and use a hypothetical business that I could theoretically set up for my office where I'm selling textbooks online. And I've known people that have done this, and it actually, once upon a time, used to be a fairly lucrative business, but the publishing industry's changed quite a bit, and you're not necessarily seeing the same amount of money being made in it now. But just as a simple example, let's say we set up an e-commerce store and sell used textbooks. So I want to pull all these together, talk about the concept of cost in the sense of one example, show you some graphs to kind of give you a sense for what this looks like when we plot it out, and then we'll talk a little bit more about some of the final closing topics of production for Friday. So on that note, have a great day. Any questions, feel free to send me an email. Otherwise, you expect to hear from me again on Friday.